My timestamp configuration consists of creating conditions, questions, punchers, buttons, profiles, and possibly button sets. Questions allow an employee to record additional information along with their punch, such as whether or not a meal break was taken or whether or not they had mileage to report. Answers are configured within the question itself, and you can see here that we have configured a yes answer for the short break question. In our General tab, we determine whether or not we want to require manager response, whether this answer should cancel their break deduction, if this response should approve the day, if this response should apply a shift transfer, follow-up text that will be displayed to the employee. If we want to direct the employee to time review, we use the forward to URL option, and we can chain questions together. For example, if we asked if the employee had sustained an on-the-job injury, our follow-up question could be, was your injury reported? On our second tab, we record what happens with the punch. In some situations, we may not want the punch to be recorded. In that case, we will prevent the punch. We can also prompt the employee for additional punches, such as when the employee was off-site during a lunch hour. We can select a comment to be added and whether or not notes are required or optional. On the pay code tab, we determine whether or not a pay code is going to be entered, whether the amount will be something that the employee will be prompted to enter or a fixed amount, whether it will be sent to the time card or schedule, what the start time will be if we're sending it to the schedule, if we will allow the employee to enter a date, and if so, what is the limit of those date ranges, whether a comment will be entered, whether notes are optional or required, and whether or not a transfer should be applied along with this pay code. And then finally, on the Notifications tab, we determine how notifications are sent. We check the box to send notification, and we indicate the subject and the message body that will be sent to the users identified in the puncher configuration. Click through the icons on the image to review the configuration options for questions. When configuring My Timestamp functionality, conditions allow us to determine when a question should be asked. For example, you can create a quick condition that says a question will always be asked. Or you can create a condition that says this question will be asked only when the employee has worked 300 minutes. The conditions must be found to be true for the employee to be presented with the question. A detailed list of all the conditions and their thresholds can be found in the Attestation Toolkit Configuration Guide. A question may have multiple conditions associated with it. All conditions must be found to be true for that question to be presented to the employee.
Click through the icons on the image to review the options for puncher configuration. Buttons are essentially configurable labels that are associated with punchers through profiles. Important to note is when configuring a button, you select a puncher to dictate offline behavior. This is important because there are certain situations where questions require a response from the server. An employee would not be able to continue in the process if we did not dictate what behavior should occur if the server is offline. Be sure to always configure an offline puncher behavior and assign it to each of your buttons so that the correct information is captured when the employee attempts to punch out in an offline condition. Profiles are where we pull together punchers, employees, and buttons. Recall that we assign an employee their attestation profile in the user-defined field we created in the additional information area in the people record. After we assign an attestation profile in that people record, we can configure which buttons and punchers are associated with those employee available groups. Let's take a look at some of the attributes in the attestation profile editor. Obviously, the available and selected groups areas will dictate for us which employees are assigned to this profile. We select a button, and for each button, we select the puncher for online behavior. Remember, we associate the offline puncher with the button itself. The other profile settings allow us to notify the employee, the manager, or other users when this puncher is used. When you're notifying other users, you put an email address in the user field that you see here. We can determine a maximum shift duration. This is used to determine how far back the system will look to apply a shift start transfer. We want to limit that so that we do not go back into previous days' shifts when looking to apply a transfer. We can prepend a work rule when performing a transfer so that that work rule transfer is made to the appropriate group. And we can force auto log off after the employee has recorded their transaction, not wait for the system to time out, but actually force a log off when the employee has completed. That should only be used for employee self-service settings. Button sets are simply a named collection of buttons. Button sets are only used by the My Timestamp URL, the attestation equivalent of the quick timestamp. The button set ID is used inside the quick timestamp URL to determine which buttons are displayed to the employees.
For employees who will access the system through quick timestamp functionality, access is granted through a parameterized URL that contains the name of the button set that the employee should be accessing. If an employee will access functionality via terminal devices, then smart views and soft key functionality will be required. My timestamp punchers are deployed to soft keys using the puncher ID in the smart view URL that's assigned to the smart key. That completes this module.